For this episode, we recommend that you use headphones to fully immerse yourself in this global conversation, linking Silicon Valley, Boulder, Stuttgart, Amsterdam, and Singapore as we bring you the world's first 8D podcast series. This is part 3 as we delve into the hidden crisis of the coronavirus pandemic. Hello and welcome to Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. I'm Chloe Cho. Let's pick up our conversation where we left off last week.
I would not underestimate the mental health aspect of this crisis. They are probably far more consequential than the physical ones.
Mental health, certainly in the United States, has been a crisis for years now, but now really it is a shared crisis across essentially every tier or realm of society. We're all facing massive questions of every time you leave your door, you could potentially contract a deadly virus.
We are in for, as a country and as a society, an unprecedented mental health crisis.
As countries tread carefully in reopening their economies, the world is beginning to understand the heavy toll that isolation and lockdown have had on societies far beyond the economic cost. Here's how Toby Ruckert, founder and CEO of UIB, a conversational AI platform in Stuttgart, Germany, sees the situation.
What I really want to emphasize is that the mental health consequences can be far more wide-reaching. There will be a whole generation of school kids, for example, where the learning would have changed and where they were not able to see their friends and where basically a whole network of support has broken away. There will be a lot of elderly who have not been visited by their sons and grandchildren for a really long time and die lonely, not as well looked after as usually, simply because everyone has to take extra care and maybe only will do the minimum necessary. There are so many society consequences that will have mental health consequences for decades to come. So I think technology is an enabler, but it can't really help to change human nature. Only we as humans can do that. And we have to analyze ourselves how we got in this mess in the first place.
The lockdowns have also brought domestic violence to a head in many cities the world over, in what Rob van Kranenburg, founder of the IoT Council, says points to how stress and anxiety are magnifying the precarious and dysfunctional nature of many relationships today.
What the lockdown is showing is the structural violence of the system on us as people, actually. It's showing, for example, in places like Holland, let's say 15% of children in unsafe environments. They cannot reach these kids because they don't have computers at home. And these are the children that normally go to libraries to do their homework. But there's also huge growth in abusive behavior in domestic violence. If you think about it, what's so awful about that? Somehow we've built a world in which people cannot even be at home for 2 or 3 weeks and then start hitting each other or something like that.
With the COVID-19 pandemic creating an unprecedented level of uncertainty across the world, as countries slowly but surely restart their economies, worries are growing about a profound and pervasive blow to global mental health. Studies into the mental health impact of previous outbreaks such as SARS from 2002 to 2003 showed an increase in suicide rates and a spike in the number of healthcare workers who had experienced emotional distress, something that's likely to be more pronounced this time around, which will slow efforts to jumpstart weakened economies, according to Jessica Groopman, founding partner of Kaleido Insights in Silicon Valley.
So this mental health, what does it mean for healthcare workers who don't have proper gear, who are not able to go back to their spouses and their families? What does it mean to not be able to trust information, cures? There's been a huge spike in cybersecurity incidents and fraud and misinformation all around this area. So again, some of these existing challenges of trust and insecurity and mental health, this is an added layer of the confidence that is required for us to restart the economy and to continue to make investments in our own lives as individuals, but also in organizations and businesses and in broader economies.
Reports of double-digit or sometimes triple-digit increases in the number of patients seeking counseling from psychiatrists and counselors are raising the alarm over the extent of the pandemic's hidden crisis. Veteran entrepreneur and venture capitalist Brad Feld, who's part of the Colorado governor's COVID-19 response team, says addressing the mental health issue is of utmost importance.
As the system undergoes a shock, it's a mental shock, it's a health shock, it's a financial shock, how do societies and communities address this monumental challenge? The world has never experienced something like this.
Well, I don't know if I have a top-down answer to that in terms of how do you address it or solve it. And you really can't predict the outcome. You can't say this is when the end point is, or once you get to this, then you're good, or you've been successful. It's this very dynamic, ever-changing thing. It has a lot of categories or principles like emergent behavior, where all of a sudden behaviors come out of nowhere that you didn't expect. For better or for worse, there's a fundamental principle of complex systems called contagion, and there's both positive and negative contagion. COVID is a contagion, and the dynamic of the COVID crisis is a complex system. I think leadership, consistent, steady, articulate leadership that listens to all the inputs, recognizes that you're in an ever-changing system where you're uncertain of what the effect of the thing you do is. And so rather than spend a lot of time analyzing things to get it right, you have to have a frame of reference and a willingness to try things, to measure, to adapt, to iterate. Very similar to how entrepreneurship works, but across these very broad, interconnected things. This is not that different than how I operate as an investor and entrepreneur. I would say for many, many people, it's incredibly uncomfortable. Many people are very used to situations that are deterministic, that have a very clear outcome, or that if you do A, B happens. And if you do B, C happens. And by the time you do the letter G, you get to finished.
Brad has been candid and forthcoming about his own personal mental struggles. As our society comes around to shaking off the stigma against mental health, he stresses that mental fitness is as important as physical health, if not more. Entrepreneurs in particular are more than 50% more likely to experience a mental health obstacle than the general population, according to Brad, due to the volatile and intense realities of running a business through hardships, setbacks, and failures in today's culture that lauds high performance and achievement. He speaks from experience, having endured failure in 2002 when the company he was running went bust as the dot-com bubble burst.
You've talked and you've written quite a bit about what happens after failure. This crisis is probably going to result in a wave of failures, business failures, and even mental breakdowns for a lot of entrepreneurs and business people. Based on your own personal experience, how does one pick up and start all over? Because at the end of the day, we're in a world where failure tends to get glamorized.
Failure sucks no matter what the context is. It's just hard. I think the cliche of sort of failure is a good thing is misguided. Failure is a component of entrepreneurship, and failure is a component of our life. And there are many things that we can extract from experiences of failure that are long-term beneficial. But the experience of failing at something sucks. I've struggled with anxiety and depression as an adult. I've had 3 that I sort of identify as long-term, significant, deep depressive episodes where I would define that as lasting for at least 3 months, in one case 2 years. I've had many other shorter depressive episodes lasting for a week or 2 or a month, spread out over periods of time. And as an adult, I'm in my mid-50s, I've worked hard at understanding the things that cause me to feel anxious and stressed, understanding how those things combine to tip me over into a depressive state. And I've learned how to manage my anxiety through a lot of different activities that are sort of in the broad new agey way described probably as self-care. For me, it's anxiety, depression, and the clinical disorder that I have is actually obsessive compulsive disorder. Some people are bipolar, some people are borderline personality disorder, some people have mania, some people just have different versions of anxiety. lots of different characteristics of it, but in some ways being a little more precise is helpful because it does then link to the cause and effect dynamic of what you're trying to do to address the issue.
While navigating his struggles with mental health, Brad has had a storied career as both an entrepreneur and investor. He set up his first startup at the age of 22 in 1987 while studying at MIT and has financed hundreds of startups including Zanga, MakerBot, and Fitbit over the past 3 decades.
I think that we are in for, as a country and as a society, an unprecedented mental health crisis. As a society, the stigma associated with mental health historically, which I would assert has been lessening in some areas, certainly in entrepreneurship. 10 years ago, nobody talked openly. 5 years ago, nobody talked openly about their struggles with depression and anxiety if they were an entrepreneur. Today, there are many, many well-known entrepreneurs on the record publicly talking about their own struggles at different points of time, whether it was situational or episodic as a result of a particular stress or failure or difficulty in their business or difficulty in their personal life, and others who have been very open about it as a long-term clinical disorder.
How are you able to operate as a successful entrepreneur and also a venture capitalist while having these personal mental struggles?
I'm not sure that the mental struggles are antithetical to the notion of success. I think in our society there's a bias that somehow when people struggle with any sort of mental health issues that somehow inhibits their ability to be successful. There are many, 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 many extremely successful people that have pretty obvious or well understood mental health disorders, whether they recognize it or not. I mean, they're certainly linked to one's sense of self-worth and sense of value, but it's not the inverse. When I'm depressed, I'm very functional. I know how to get myself out of the house. I know how to do my work. I know how to make it through the day. I know how to operate at a level that is probably not my 100% best, but is 80%, 90%. But it takes 100% of all of my energy to do that. I describe my time when I'm depressed as the absence of joy, just the complete and total absence of joy. So if I'm depressed and I'm functional, I can still be successful. People around me might say, he seems a little off, he seems a little tired. That kind of language versus the idea of a person curled up in a ball in the corner, catatonic and unable to do something, where you're actually, for me at least, able to function outside of that one lane that I'm focused on. When I was 47, I had about 7 years ago, I had a very deep depressive episode that lasted about 6 months, and I started therapy again. I had done therapy in my 20s. And one of the things that I've done in the last 7 years is develop a number of different activities and routines that enable me not to fall into that depressive state.
Those activities and routines include running marathons and taking a digital Sabbath once a week, as well as quitting alcohol, avoiding drugs, and minimizing caffeine, all of which helped him remain prolific not only in investing and managing businesses, but also in writing. Some of Brad's books, such as Venture Deals, are considered a must-read among startup entrepreneurs or those wanting to understand the world of venture capitalists. His latest work, titled Startup Community Way, is due out in June.
How do you think the society is going to come out of this? Since there is no vaccine, and any vaccine might only emerge 12 months, 18 months.
One is recognize this is a long-term experience. And once you start with that, you won't be in a position where you have endless false hope dashed. This is going to be 12 months, 18 months, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be distressing, and lots of people will die, and there will be lots of economic challenges. And if some magical thing happens that causes it to be a lot less than that, great, that's awesome, but don't count on that. And so instead of being inappropriately either optimistic or carrying around a fantasy about it, have a realistic viewpoint and then take action against that realistic viewpoint. I've always found that in moments of crises, people who focus on themselves first are the ones that are most agitated. Put your energy into helping others around you, helping with what's going on. It lowers the anxiety enormously, and it allows you to be, at least for me, allows me to be much clearer thinking about what has impact and what doesn't.
That clear thinking is needed in times of stress and anxiety. For a start, it remains to be seen whether people can overcome that pathological fear of germs in the form of germophobia or mysophobia while being swept up in a crisis of confidence. Industries from retail, travel, tourism, food and beverage to hospitality and beyond are furloughing staff or downsizing operations altogether amid a broad push by businesses to accelerate automation, robotics, AI, and machine learning to prepare for the next plague. These conflicting factors are likely to renew automation anxiety, as was the case in the early 1800s when the term Luddites first emerged, followed by the 1920s and 30s when workers raged against machines and mass production for taking jobs away.
As the world reels from being shell-shocked from remote working, social distancing, just this paranoia over germs out there, what do you think will be the outcome of this move to pandemic-proof their businesses, their economies?
One of the trends we were tracking quite closely prior to this was this rise in employee wellness and essentially the extreme evolution of employer-offered healthcare and wellness programs. What do those look like in a post-coronavirus or post-COVID world in terms of what is a corporation's obligation and responsibility for mental health, for personal resilience, for offering a workforce that is trusted, is safe, and where there is a sense of confidence regardless of what happens. But again, we have sort of new context around that. As corporations don't look to their workforces, but also look to the public sector and also to government, what is a social safety net? What are the obligations and responsibilities of the government to its citizens, and also of the government to the private sector? These questions have a renewed call and I think a renewed interest as we work towards a perhaps more resilient or agile state of being for the next coming number of years.
As shown in the fight against coronavirus, what if governments don't have all the solutions and are unable to come to our rescue? Here's Rob van Kranenburg as he recalls a possible scenario that was projected at the Global Futures Forum, an annual strategic foresight conference which counted a pandemic among 5 major threats facing the world back in 2012.
The most radicals basically say this is not up to governments. And so why is it not up to governments? In this 2012 meeting, where the professionals actually realized that society could be broken by this inability of the state to deal with the digital. So what do? Well, they start disciplining. That's all they know. That's what they can do. So there's this kind of militarization of society that's in there. This will hasten the downfall of these systems even more. Because what they have in front of them is not citizens from the Middle Ages or citizens from 1700 or citizens from 1800. What they have in front of them is solution architects that these citizens are, who have now even far more or better tools than they ever had. We'll see more militarization, more disciplining, more control, which we are basically seeing now. But this will lead to breakdown because there's no agency, there's no vitality in that kind of system. So these governments, the best thing they can do is get out of the way. Get out of the way and make sure that they allow all these things that are basically happening in the self-organization of people that can do these systems far better, to allow them to build. So that's the situation basically in which we're in. It's a serious situation.
Should governments get out of the way? Are average citizens today empowered with all the required tools to lead an era of self-organization? Just months into a global ordeal with COVID-19, what we've witnessed were the limits of technology to beat the biggest menace facing humanity since the Spanish flu of 1918. Caused by the H1N1 influenza A virus, the Spanish flu lasted just under 2 years, but infected 500 million, or about a third of the world's population at the time. Its death toll was estimated somewhere between 17 million and 50 million, while some argue that as many as 100 million might have died. As of this week, coronavirus has infected 4 million worldwide and has claimed nearly 300,000 lives, although some believe the actual figure could be as much as 60% higher.
The assumption behind why we're using technology to date has been around efficiency, scale, cost reduction, essentially. That does not include public health. That does not really include mental health. It does not particularly include resiliency per se. Arguably, you could say efficiency is related to that, but this has just not been part of the core kind of assumed vernacular of technological development and innovation. There are pockets that are interested in these areas, of course, things like green tech or climate-focused tech or mental health tech. They exist. But now I think this becomes really front and center and mainstream for any kind of business.
With the situation revealing gaps in infrastructure and the limits of healthcare systems, as countries re-emerge from lockdowns, there needs to be a shift in mindset to adjust to the new normal.
The first thing that has been revealed globally is just the issue of infrastructure. Now, there's a lot of people working from home. Companies like Netflix, they're throttling the quality of the videos simply to cater with the demand when people watch from home. But when you look at other areas like hospitals, for example, they've been not well and not enough staffed for many years. And like one caretaker, for example, who used to look after, say, 5 patients in a night shift many years ago, now may even have to look after 20, which is 4 times. This is still a single person. Also, the pay of a certain segment of people, whether that is, as an example, in hospitals, but also even in cashiers in supermarkets, has been debated heavily in society, and rightfully so. So I think people are coming to learn about the essentials, whether it's a healthcare system, whether it's internet connectivity, or whether it's a payment at the supermarket.
While coronavirus revives age-old questions about the economic and social effects of pandemics, if a large number of people are mentally fragile, unwell, or feel disenfranchised by the tectonic shifts in society, how will these trends affect voting patterns?
At a very divisive time in the American society, how will this virus pandemic affect sentiment? Americans are heading to the polls later this year.
God, I don't know. If I had a thing that I could influence, it would be for everybody to lower the temperature on the whole political debate. I think this is a moment where, I'll speak for Americans, I don't speak globally, but for Americans, this is a moment where we should be coming together, not tearing ourselves apart. Be successful and be healthy and get over this pandemic, but do it in a way that's unifying rather than a way that's dividing. And it is a real sadness that I have as a person in their mid-50s in the United States. This is a moment where we should be able to rise together to really be unified and help each other. I have many, many people that I interact with on a daily basis that may have a different political ideology than I do, but we're all working hard together to try to solve a bunch of these problems. But the top-level noise, the partisan noise and the antagonism is so distressing that I think most of the people that I interact, we look at each other and we're like, we're not going to worry about that. We got this thing in front of us.
What's ahead is a new paradigm that may shape this decade and beyond. A new academic paper by the New York Federal Reserve concludes that deaths caused by the 1918 Spanish flu profoundly shaped German society in the following years and contributed to the strengthening of the Nazi Party in the early 1930s. In a world that is grappling with a surge in populist sentiment, how will a shaken American electorate vote at the polls? The study also found a stronger correlation between influenza mortality and the vote share won by right-wing extremists in regions that had blamed minorities, in particular Jews, for medieval plagues. Coronavirus has infected 1.4 million in the United States and led to the confirmed deaths of more than 81,000 Americans. The virus, which was first identified in China, has also been blamed for a surge in anti-Asian racism in the United States, as well as in a number of other countries. Stay tuned for Part 4 as our global conversation linking North America, Europe, and Asia continues next week, as we thank Brad Feld of Foundry Group, Jessica Groopman of Kaleido Insights, Toby Ruckert of UIB, and Rob Van Kranenburg of the IoT Council. And I'm Chloe Cho. Join us next week on Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. Thank you for tuning in.